Caddis Maximus here, this time with a review of the Harbor Freight doming block set. This is primarily sold for jewelers to make domes and all sorts of curves and arcs. This is oddly one of the old school products at Harbor Freight, and Harbor Freight, especially over the last 2, 3, 4 years, has really just revamped all their products. And interestingly enough, this doming block kit is probably one of their oldest products. Easily 10 years that they've sold this set, and it is still sold today. I believe it's about $45, although I bought this one 5, 6 years ago, quite a while ago, before it had a wood block base. The new ones do have a wood block that will hold the metal doming die, as well as all 18 of these rounded punches. I don't do any kind of jewelry making. The reason I kind of bought this was twofold. One was because I like these little doming punches, and what's interesting, I'll mention this real fast, is they have a sizing on them, and you might think, well, that's a 14 millimeter. These sizes are close, but they're not actually spot on. And that's something people can help me out with online. I don't know if the sizing really should be 14 millimeters, but like this one would measure about 13.5 millimeters. So I assume it's some kind of numbering system related to jewelry, so there'll be a translation. As far as I know, the sets are the same. They use hardened carbon steel punches, such as these, which just have various different hemispheres ground onto them. The grinding, I would say, is not perfect. They may be better on the newer ones. On these older ones, it's okay, but sometimes there's some little lumps or little flats. They're definitely not perfect. And you would think for $45 you'd want something that is perfect, but really, these are hardened steel. That's pretty expensive, and it's a lot of work to make 18 different sizes of these be relatively smooth, especially with tool wear on the machines that you're making these from. So really, $45 for a Chinese set is actually a reasonable price, because I'm sure if you get like professional Swiss-made one of these, it would probably be $300. So the build quality is good, but not good enough. The other thing that you get is this hardened steel block. So it is a ground square block. I've measured it. It's actually surprisingly square. I don't know if you could use it as a machinist standard for squareness, but it's pretty good. And what they have appeared to have done is taken ball end mills and just made a bunch of different pockets, hemisphere pockets on all 6 sides of various different sizes. And then maybe went in there with a little bit of a grinding stone. But you can see the tool marks. It's actually pretty smooth, so you can see them, but they're not real large. But that's how they make this block. And so the idea is that you would take some kind of die, or excuse me, I always want to say anvil, but you would take a punch. And you could say that, well, if I wanted to make something round, I could use a punch about this size. But depending on what I'm doing, I may need more space on each side. So you just try to go around the block until maybe you found this side. And then you might use a hole like that. Now, the reason that you would want to make, there would be a difference, is say you actually want to make a full hemisphere. Then that would need to fill in this whole pocket, and you would need to make sure that you had space on each side of the punch. Otherwise, you'd either end up damaging the block, not getting a complete hemisphere, or actually getting the punch kind of jammed into the socket. The reason I got it was because I've always kind of liked making custom spring washers, or just ones that will take a little bit of expansion and contraction. And I used to just bend little thin washers like that until I got this doming block kit. And now I can use a doming block kit to make cone type spring washers. I'll show that in just a second here. We're going to go ahead and see how well this works out. I'm using, since this is a sheet metal table, I'm using a large amount of mass, a big chunk of steel here to support the block. If you are noticing an A286 or a 660 SS, that is indeed what this big old chunk of steel, stainless steel is indeed A286. So anybody in the know will realize that's quite a special piece of steel. So I'm going to try using this with a hammer, and then actually I have a much larger fender washer, and I'm going to show how you can use these in a press, and sometimes it's easier to use these in a press than it is via hand. I have a pretty thin washer here. Try to get that washer nice and centered in that little hole, and see if I can't get it to cooperate here and make it a spring washer. And I didn't have to tap it too much, and this is usually how it's worked out. And this is really what I've used it for. Is now look, I took that flat washer, and it really is just a few little nice taps with the hammer. What's surprising about using these types of punch and die systems is that the more solid a surface you have the die sitting on, the better the results. So that's why, even though I'm on a more of a springy table, adding a large amount of mass under it really helped a lot. So once again, look at that. I made a little type of cone washer. So if you just like the look of a cone washer, or using it to maintain a little bit of spring tension, this little doming block has been great. And that actually, it's paid itself off for me just doing little operations like this. All right, give me a second here. I'm going to get this all set up on a press, and then I'm going to see if I can't turn this thick fender washer into a little cup. All right, here we go. We have it in the bed plate press, and so I'm going to use the largest, which is advertised as a size number 24, and start the curvature on this washer, and then I'm going to move it to a slightly smaller hole to finish out the doming effect. Just showing how that a press can be a bit nicer. This is a bed plate press, not a standard frame press, so it does work a little differently. I have a lot of feedback and control because it's extremely rigid. And so I'll be able to just feel right when this hits the bottom of the die. I also have a magnet set up, so the way this is set up, this is actually not on the magnet. I have through holes because this used to be a tinsel testing rig, so I'm able to put a magnet in the hole and then stick things to the top of this. The other difference on this using this type of press is that the bed plate moves up rather than something from the top coming down. It takes quite a bit more force. Can really feel how much pressure I'm putting onto that little washer. And I feel it stopping right there. Let's back it off. To give you an idea of how strong that magnet is, this washer will still stick to the punch here, even though it's more than 3 inches long. That's how strong of a magnet I have. Now we can see right here how we've gotten most of the shape of this cone, and now I'm going to put it in actually a slightly smaller hole to try to finish making it an actual hemisphere. As you can see, I've got it in the smaller hole. The critical thing about using this setup in the press, the backs of the anvils, the little round balls, are actually pretty flat, so they're pretty good to use like this. You just really need to make sure that it's extremely well centered. So you get closer and closer. It doesn't even hurt to use a dial caliper or something to really get it as centered as possible. Otherwise, you run the risk of the die or of the punch hitting along the wall of the die, wanting to bend over, and then of course being able to slip out under the immense pressure on it when using a press. So press work, you have to be careful because there's huge pressures involved. Many of the first thing that you do besides safety glasses is making sure all your work is absolutely as dead centered as possible. So we're getting that pretty close here. And sorry about the flicker here. I think that's related to the light that I'm using. There we go. Anyway, one of the hardest things to do is get that washer absolutely centered in there when you're pressing. So let's see how well I can make a dome. You can really feel the pressure. And with this type of press setup, it really is real obvious when you bottom out. It just stops moving. Let's see how that came out. And here we are. It's actually not too bad, maybe not perfectly spherical. You'd have to do just a little bit more work on it to get it just a little more spherical, but it really does work. And when you use it in something like a press, it's just really consistent. And a lot of times or not a lot of times, but there are a few comments about these not working very consistently. And if you have just slightly thicker metals, particularly steels, it takes quite a bit of force to actually get them to form properly. And so that was kind of the point of this section. Showing a press is showing how these things really will make pretty darn nice curved shapes if you do use them right or use them with enough pressure. So anyway, that was the video review and demonstration of this Harbor Freight doming block kit, and it really does work surprisingly well. Actually, one of the more useful tools, even though it seems odd, I've actually found quite a bit of uses for it. And I wanted to zoom in again to show that washer that I turned into a hemisphere. And really using, anvil dies and anvils, you can really get a nice, smooth, curved shape. This was actually kind of a dinged up washer, and it actually fixed all those dings. If I can get this to stay curved. And the other thing I wanted to show is with a mild steel, you won't have any issues with wrinkling, tearing. There might be a touch of something right there. Otherwise, besides a couple of dings, if you were to see this in a box, you'd say, oh, that's some kind of factory manufactured strange kind of dome washer, a little cup, and just make it with a little tool like this. Anyway, I really appreciate everybody watching and subscribing. If you haven't subscribed, please do. Until next time, Catus Maximus out.